Welcome everybody to all of you here in person, on WebEx and live stream to this edition of our Policy Research Talk series dedicated to our spectacular new policy research report, Industrial Policy for Development, Approaches in the 21st Century. Now, industrial policy is one of the topics in development that never really disappears. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton, in his report on manufactures, said, "The independence and security of a country appear to be materially connected with the prosperity of manufactures." And he added, "The public purse must supply the deficiency of private resources." In 2020, in India, Prime Minister Modi introduced a production-linked initiative scheme saying the country must become self-reliant and every product that can be made in India should be made here. We aim to manufacture everything from chips to ships. So I don't need to persuade you that today industrial policy has taken on a new urgency. For several reasons. Global growth has slowed, technology is evolving, and no one wants to be left behind. Protection and sanctions are increasing, and no one wants to be too dependent on other countries. China has established manufacturing dominance with some support from industrial policy, and everybody wants to be China. This excellent report presents a wealth of illuminating evidence and addresses a practical set of questions. What are the tools, from tariffs and subsidies to industrial parks and skill development? Which activities should governments target? Jobs, innovation, exports? And who is equipped to do this? Governments that have capacity, fiscal space, and countries with a large market size. These are the questions that this report addresses, and we are fortunate to have the two co-authors, Anna Fernandez and Tristan Reed, with us today. They're both, I assure you, accomplished economists in the Development Research Group. Anna focuses mostly on trade and development, and Tristan focuses mostly on everything. In addition, so, apart from Tristan and Anna, I'm especially happy to welcome our discussant, Martin Reiser. He's the World Bank's senior representative for European Economic Cooperation and head of office in Paris. I could say a lot about Martin, but let me simply say that he is one of the best economists I have ever had the pleasure of knowing, and one of the most thoughtful people who is engaged in both operations and policy. Housekeeping rules: you will speak for 45 minutes, after which we'll hear from Martin for about 10 minutes, unless he chooses to speak longer, which would be fine. We will then open the floor for questions and answers from the audience. If you have a question, please use the raise hand feature in WebEx or signal your question in the chat, and I will call on you during questions and answers. This session is being recorded, so please ensure your microphone is muted when you're not speaking. Anna, Tristan.
Well, I'll start. Oh, it is. Sorry. I'll start by thanking Aditya for the introduction, everyone in the room, everyone connected. It's a real pleasure to be here with Tristan to present our report that has been published about 2 months ago and has, we think, generated a lot of discussion, and we hope it will generate more. So as many of you know, to give you a little bit of historical context on where we are coming from. About 30 years ago, the World Bank wrote or produced this very famous report called East Asian Miracle. This report tried to understand the growth experience in East Asia and ended up concluding that it was mostly due to fundamentals, very strong fundamentals. So it also ended up being the report that sort of stigmatized industrial policy and was criticized back then and since then by many policymakers and economists who thought that industrial policy actually played a role for that experience. That report also allowed the president of the bank at the time to say in different words that what happens in East Asia stays in East Asia. The culture, history, and politics were unique, and this would never be replicable anywhere else. But the world has changed very much in the last 30 years, and perhaps even more strongly in the last few years. And so, as Aditya said, in a new, very different global economic environment with slower growth, automation, protectionism, geopolitics, it came time for the World Bank to revisit issues of industrial policy. And as we've learned after starting actually to work on the report, this was actually a request that was placed by developing countries at the board that the World Bank should revisit industrial policy. And through INDRAMIT, this request came down to the research department, and we worked on this report trying to provide sort of a new perspective on industrial policy that would take into account evidence built up over the last decades. And we tried to produce a report that's pragmatic and, I'm going to say it, non-ideological. So we tried to address several questions. What is, who does, how to do industrial policy, which activities to target, how to get institutions right. And then we also have some applications when industrial policy is implemented with specific goals to increase jobs or reduce pollution, for example. So we're going to start with the definition. So in the report, the definition that we use for industrial policy sort of builds on definitions that have been used in several other reports and studies. We think of industrial policy as government action to grow a strategic business activity. So first, we use the expression industrial policy because that's the historically used expression, and also because these kinds of policies have most often been used to promote manufacturing. But we are very clear in the report that this government action may be promoting business activities in other sectors, not just manufacturing, agribusiness, critical minerals, tourism, for example. In our definition, we specifically use the expression business activity rather than product, industry, or sector, even though we're going to be using those expressions, of course, but just because we want to give the sense that government action may be just about promoting a different way of doing things in an existing sector, for example, using AI in forestry. And then the word strategic is also crucial. Industrial policy means that the government is deciding that one or some activities are more important than others. Although, as I said, the initial sort of request let's say request for this report came from developing countries at the board, we also wanted to consult with a broad network of country economists that we have in the bank that work in client countries, with client countries around the world. And so we conducted a survey last year asking them if they had been asked by their government client counterparts about advice on industrial policy. And overwhelmingly, they said that yes, they had been asked, and that governments were asking about advice on industrial policy that would help them create jobs, increase investment, improve domestic competitiveness. These were the key goals. All the other goals that we hear now, I think every day, we hear about industrial policy being applied especially by high-income countries for national security, geopolitical concerns, or supply chain resilience reasons, or climate change. They were not the priority of developing economies. They matter, and we will talk about those, but they are, there's a first and utmost priority, which is the industrial policy that can help countries develop and grow. So an exercise we did in the report was to try to think a little bit about what has been this relationship between the World Bank and industrial policy. And to do that, we looked at the last 20 years of prior policy actions that are required for countries to receive, World Bank DPLs, policy loans. And in the text of those prior actions, we identified some of the policies that were actually industrial policy tools. And so we emphasized, actions that were relating to SOEs, subsidies, or trade policy. And what we found when looking at what was being asked of country governments to do about these industrial policy tools, that, let's say, in general, for SOEs and for subsidies, the World Bank operations were actually more supportive of industrial policy than we thought. Generally, what was being asked of countries was not to eliminate subsidies or privatize entirely SOEs, but rather to reform SOEs, increase transparency, improve governance, or reform subsidy programs. When it comes to trade policy, their prior actions were very clear. Whenever there was a requirement for governments to reform, it was to eliminate or reduce tariffs. But so this gives a sense that the relationship between the World Bank and industrial policy is perhaps more nuanced than we think. Another example we give in the report is about IFC, just IFC activity. IFC invests not only in a specific sector, but in a specific company. We call that in the report quasi-industrial policy because it doesn't seem we can get any more close to industrial policy than that. And then finally, thinking about the present approach in the World Bank of having these 5 sectors, that's really an explicitly vertical approach. We are thinking about promoting tourism, agribusiness, or high value-added manufacturing because they can create jobs. So again, another interesting nuanced relationship of the World Bank with industrial policy. So the second question we address in the report is try to document who does industrial policy. And here the key message that we have is that developing economies are actually heavier users of industrial policy than advanced economies. And this is a conclusion or a key message that's a little bit different from what you might have seen in recent years from the IMF, what you might have seen from OECD or EBRD, because those other institutions have been using exclusively the Global Trade Alert database, which is a database that collects announcements on news about policies implemented. We also use that database in our report, but we also make a strong case that especially for the poorer economies, that is not the best source of information on industrial policy because industrial policy is done differently in those countries. So here I'm going to show you our key message using 3 different sources of data that we use in the report. So first we look at the national development plans of 183 countries. The most recent plan, in those plans we identify which are the industries that are prioritized for growth, and we count how many of those. So what you see in this chart here is for each country, which is a dot, how many industries are in the National Development Plan, and then you have GDP per capita in the x-axis. And you can see a clear negative relationship. The countries that are richer, they prioritize fewer industries for growth in their national development plans. This is perhaps because they already have more industries developed and they tend to promote more cross-cutting technologies such as AI or biotechnology, for example. But it also indicates to us that developing economies, towards the left of the graph, they are more giving higher priority to diversification and industrial policy for diversification of their industries. The other 2 pieces of data that we use to show that developing economies are heavier users of industrial policy come from 2 classic measures of industrial policy, tariffs and subsidies. So first on tariffs, we looked at the level of tariffs, average level of tariffs by income group. That's what you see on the left chart. And you can see clearly that developing economies impose higher import tariffs than advanced economies. This chart is based on data for 2023, but this would be exactly qualitatively similar if we had used the US big increase in tariffs in 25, 26 the chart would still look, would still have the same pattern. But looking at levels of tariffs is not enough to say that this is being used as industrial policy, because as many of you know, developing countries rely extensively on import tariffs as a source of tax revenue. So perhaps they are just imposing higher tariffs because they need to collect more, they need to mobilize more revenue. But that's why we need to then look at the chart on the right, where we look at the dispersion. So how different are import tariffs across products within a country? And there we also see that poorer countries, so the countries that are not in the first high-income category, have higher dispersion in their tariffs. So they are protecting some industries more than others and using tariffs as a tool for industrial policy. Then we look at subsidies. So subsidies are extremely difficult to measure. We had, and many different institutions are coming up with, ideas or measurement of how much industrial policy represents in their country. Here we wanted to have a global perspective to cover a reasonably large set of countries. And so we used the best data available, which comes from the IMF and from the Global Tax Expenditures database. And what we did for each country was to combine two components of business subsidies. First is what the government transfers directly to firms, so that what we call direct funding. So we have a data on what's the total sum of that. And then to that, we add tax expenditures, which are the tax exemptions. And so we come up with a total amount of what's being provided to businesses as subsidies. We divide that by GDP, and that's what we show in these two charts. So if you look at the chart on the left, and if you can see the colors, you will see that the line that's growing the most and is the highest as of 2022 is the green line. So that's not high-income countries. That's, again, upper-middle-income countries. So, again, evidence that, developing and emerging economies are heavier users of industrial policy according to these various measures that we use. So then in the report, we go into the longest chapter. Those of you who will read or have read the report, this is really the longest chapter because it, of course, tackles the most difficult and important question, how to do industrial policy. And here we're going to talk about the comprehensive set of tools that we include as part of our set of industrial policies. And we're going to think about a typology of what can countries do depending on their characteristics before jumping to a series of lessons based on the evidence. So this is our comprehensive set of tools on industrial policy. So we group them into three categories. And importantly, we start with the first category, which is often not part of the discussions on industrial policy that tend to focus on tariffs and subsidies. To be fair, in Latin America, this category has always been there. They just had to disguise its name and call it productive development policies. But this is a set of tools which are public inputs that may be tailored to the needs of an activity or an industry. And they are important because they can tackle market failures directly. So industrial parks or special economic zones can address coordination failures. Skills development programs can address technical skills that are provided in the market. And tools like market access assistance or quality infrastructure can address asymmetric information. We then go, and another thing that's important, and I think Tristan will touch a little bit on this, is that many of these tools can actually be provided at relatively low cost, which is also makes them more attractive to use in different contexts. We then have a large set of tools that we categorize as market incentives. So these change relative prices. They tend to be the more controversial, and they also often elicit retaliation from trading partners. But they are being heavily used in many countries. So among that set, they are still quite different among themselves. We have some of the tools that are actually first choice. They also tackle, underinvestment in industries with positive spillovers directly. So these are production subsidies. And in our report, our definition of production subsidies is quite encompassing. It also covers tax exemptions and subsidized credit, as well as direct transfers to businesses. We also have innovation subsidies, also first choice. But then you have a series of other measures recently used by many countries. For example, commodity export bans or local content requirements. These are implemented to try to foster either downstream or upstream industries, but they do it in a very indirect way. And some other tools, they are trying to promote infant industries, but they have costs for the economy, for example, import tariffs. And we have a series of other tools, and we're going to see some examples on whether they are effective later on. Finally, we have another set of tools that we call these macroeconomic interventions, where here the government action is to promote some very broad activities. So competitive exchange rate devaluations can be used to promote the broad activity of exporting. R&D tax credits can be used to promote the broad activity of innovation or R&D. So with all these tools, it was important for us to think in the report about putting them into a framework that can help policymakers as well as researchers think about what's feasible in different country contexts. And so we identified 3 key country characteristics that determine policy feasibility. There are other characteristics, but these certainly play a role with different importance for different tools. So the first characteristic is government bandwidth. So by government bandwidth, we mean more than just state capacity or administrative capabilities, but the fact that the government has enough workforce that's dedicated to interact closely with businesses. This is important for tools, for example, like skills development programs that really need to be tailored to the needs of particular investors or particular businesses in particular sectors. Then we have market size. And here we want to consider both the size of the domestic economy, so the size of the domestic middle class, but also the size of destination markets with which the country may have a preferential trade agreement. And market size is absolutely key for economies of scale to be realized. And finally, fiscal space is, of course, key to be able to implement any tool that's expensive, like subsidies. So then what we propose is a typology where we classify or we think of countries with different combinations of characteristics, and we identify what are the tools that are feasible for each combination of country characteristics. So in this table, if you look at the very first row, this covers countries with small size, small bandwidth, small fiscal space. These tend to be the poorer countries, and also I would say the majority of World Bank client countries. So for those countries, they might need industrial policy very much to diversify their economies, but the set of feasible policies that they can use is actually quite thin. So they have industrial parks, commodity export bans, competitive exchange rate devaluation. In order for other tools to become feasible, countries need to have more of some characteristic. If they have more of bandwidth, they can also implement these other public inputs that require a lot of interaction with the government. If they have more of market size, they can also implement local content requirements or tariffs. And then as you go down the table, and there are more cases, we just couldn't fit them all here. If you go to the last row of the table, you get to the case of most high-income economies, which have large size, large fiscal space, large bandwidth. And for those, the menu of tools is the whole set of tools. But just because they're feasible, it doesn't mean that countries should implement them. And we'll learn about the effectiveness of the different tools in a few minutes. So before almost turning to Tristan, I want to mention an argument that we make in the report that thinks about these government characteristics, these country characteristics. And basically what we argue is that we think that industrial policy today is more replicable than it was in the past, and it is thanks to improvements in these characteristics. So in terms of government bandwidth, we discuss and provide evidence that there are many independent agencies that can complement ministries of trade and industry and can interact with the private sector and be able to better implement industrial policy. In terms of market size, countries' middle classes have been growing and countries have been engaging in regional agreements, which also augment the size of the market they can serve. And maybe the last one, a bit more controversial, although there are many debt problems, many countries, this doesn't apply to all countries, but taking a sort of a long-term view relative to maybe some decades ago, fiscal space has become larger. Tax revenue to GDP has increased in at least a sufficient number of countries that it becomes more feasible to implement some policies. So before turning to Tristan, let me just mention what we do next that he will tell you about. So as we said, this is a report that's evidence-based, and we wanted to understand what have we learned about effectiveness and efficiency of different tools. And there's been quite a lot of evidence, and we've tried to rely mostly on the studies that are most causal, using difference in differences, using as long time horizons as possible. And there were two maybe caveats, but also lessons that we learned based on the evidence that we reviewed, and that are actually interesting openings for future research. One is that most of the evidence we have is on manufacturing. Of course, industrial policy has been applied to manufacturing mostly, but it has also moved to other sectors, and we still know very little of whether it's effective or efficient in those other sectors. Second, I'm talking about effectiveness and efficiency. Most studies overwhelmingly look at effectiveness. Did a tool achieve what it meant to achieve? Does market access assistance improve exporter performance? Yes, we can see that. But was the tool efficient? Were the benefits larger than the costs? This is often absent from studies. So again, an opening to future research. And now I'm going to give the floor to Tristan, who will tell you about all the lessons.
Thank you, Anna. So I'll take you through some of the lessons now. So the first is about industrial parks, and we introduced this as a very straightforward way to address a coordination failure. There's a lot of two nice papers which I'll highlight. So one looks at 10 African economies and finds that industrial parks increased consumption and educational attainment within a relatively small radius around the park. In India, it showed it created jobs for women, moving them out of agriculture and finding new jobs in manufacturing. A couple points that we highlight, or I'll just say one thing you hear a lot is that those special economic zones are complicated and they rarely work. What we're talking about here to solve the coordination failure is not necessarily a special economic zone. So the zones don't need different regulatory regimes. Maybe they just need a one-stop shop to interact with the regulators that already exist. You don't necessarily need fiscal incentives, just connections to infrastructure like electricity, water in the same place. A second point is that they don't necessarily need to be implemented entirely by the government. In Costa Rica, they have 31 export zones which are operated by independent private firms. In Turkey, the World Bank actually has a program where the government did do the upfront investment, but then very quickly sold its positions off and so recovered the money quite quickly. So for those reasons, we argue this is a good tool available even if you don't have fiscal space or bandwidth. Another point is about trade-offs. So I think the examples of failure are often where these zones were built in very remote areas, far from a port or basic things like that. And so I think one of the key trade-offs here you'll find is between regional equity goals and sort of broader growth and success of the parks. So that was a public input. I'll now turn to a market incentive, production subsidies. These are often given as, say, corporate income tax exemptions. And one thing we emphasize in the report is it's best to pay subsidies proportional to either sales, production, or costs rather than profits. Why is that? Because if you want to change the relative price of cost and output to induce more investment, say. I'll give you 3 examples of these. So the first 2 are subsidies for capital expenditure. The first is in Korea. This is the famous effort to promote the heavy and chemical industry. They guaranteed foreign loans. The Korean Development Bank also subsidized credit. This was shown to be, by a series of papers that come out only in the last couple years, effective in raising sales, employment, and labor productivity, but crucially, after 10 years and onwards for a total of 33, it raised total factor productivity in these industries. And so this is interesting to reference back to the East Asian Miracle Report. There they said the cost of subsidies was about 0.4% of GDP over 6 years, so 2.4% of GDP. They said that was excessively costly in the report. Today, the estimate is that the economy is 3% larger each year today because of those subsidies and the accumulation of capital. So, I mean, we can debate counterfactuals, but that shows just a clear benefits significantly outweighing costs. Another way to think about investment in capital is to subsidize investment in human capital. That example comes from Romania, where there was a payroll tax exemption given for workers in the software development industry. And the key there was to recognize that you wanted to incentivize individuals to train themselves, because in that industry, human capital is more relevant than physical capital, as in heavy industry. A third thing I want to point out is that you may be not clear as a government whether you want human capital investment or physical capital investment. And so an alternative is to actually just subsidize sales and allow the firms to choose the combination of labor and capital that they invest. There's very little work on this, but there's a nice paper in the US where they compare subsidies for kilowatt hours produced by renewable energy and then subsidies for capital investment in renewable energy, and they find greater productivity growth for the sales subsidy. So that's the intuition I just explained. Okay, so a couple more. So commodity export bans and local content requirements. These can be thought of as two sides of the same coin, so trying to indirectly affect either a downstream or an upstream market. So the local content requirement is, say, a requirement that foreign investors buy from local firms. That's a subsidy upstream, so the producers of the inputs get more demand. Conversely, a commodity export ban, you restrict the export of a commodity, you lower the price domestically, and so the users of it downstream are facing a policy. And countries might do this because, say, they don't have fiscal space to subsidize the industries directly, so they're going to use these indirect regulations. I'll talk about two case studies from Indonesia. So Indonesia is, I think, known for having lots of local content requirements. I have a policy brief on this. In terms of effectiveness, they've actually been quite successful. So if you look at foreign investment projects, they consume more local content than domestic firms. That's also grown over time in key industries. At the same time, you've also seen like a decline in the, so jobs go up, but the average wage goes down. So you've seen growth of basically low-wage assembly jobs in these industries. At the same time, you don't see export growth, research and development, or investment in intangibles. So there's an argument that by doing the local content requirement, you focus the firms on this assembly and compliance with the rule, but you avoid the sort of larger growth. Now, that's not the only counterfactual. I mean, maybe the export growth was going to go to Vietnam anyway, and they've actually done better than they could. And so I think that's a challenge you face when better than they could have if they just didn't do the local content requirement. So that's a challenge in evaluating these. Second thing about commodity export bans. So Indonesia banned the export of raw nickel and bauxite. At the same time, interestingly, you see very different results across those two commodities. In nickel, there was a lot of foreign direct investment, growth in domestic value added, but in bauxite, there was actually a decline in processing of bauxite locally. And the intuition for that is that Indonesia has a very large market share for nickel, and so the buyers of nickel had no alternative but to do their processing there. Bauxite, it had a much smaller market share, and so the buyers could go other places. Although I will caveat that we're seeing kind of in the longer run, some maybe effectiveness of this. So bauxite, contains aluminum. You're now seeing investment in aluminum smelting. So I think for both of these, you could say they've created a distortion in the short run, but I think in the long run, the jury is still out. Okay, public procurement. I want to mention this because it comes up in every country we've talked to. They want to have rules for public procurement of pharmaceuticals, building materials to be directed to local firms. There's a good set of papers now showing that orders from the government can boost productivity. There's a study from Kenya that shows that it creates jobs, kind of obviously if they have more sales, but there's more productivity in the long run. And they say this is about comparable to trading with a multinational for the first time. So if this is a boost to productivity, maybe there can be benefits from the government allocating that more to local companies. Our guidance there is to say, you need to state the characteristics that you want. So maybe other than just local, you want it green production. Green cement is something there's an opportunity for. You could also think of labor rules. But the key thing that I think we don't have enough evidence on is how much fiscal space is required. So are the local producers more expensive? And then maybe if they grow, how much tax revenue do you get back from them in the future? Another caveat is that the orders must be large enough for the industry to achieve scale. Obviously, in a big country, you can do that. Brazil, for example, has the biggest health procurement in the world. Another way to do this is actually to create standardized catalogs for all ministries, so to make sure that they're just buying the same good with the same characteristics. Okay, two last messages that I think may be a little counterintuitive. So you hear a lot industrial policy should be temporary. That's in the infant industry argument where you're trying to build something new and you think it can become competitive. There's a question of how long that should be. A lot of countries have subsidy programs that only last for 3 years. We took the view in the report that it should be at least a decade, 10 years that a policy lasts. Why is that? Two perspectives. So one is that governments like India, for example, use industrial policy as a substitute for the fundamentals. So they say in their announcements of subsidies in India that they're going to do this while they work on electric power and skills. Those fundamentals take a long time to develop. So by their argument, it must take longer. More directly, if you look at the subsidy success stories, for example, solar panels and shipbuilding in China, solar panels, we know the costs were reduced massively through patents. In shipbuilding, China took a lot of market share from Korea and Japan. These were subsidy programs that lasted a decade. We had summarized this as saying structural change takes time. This, of course, poses challenges, I think, especially for democracies. So in the United States, we had a green industrial program that lasted for 3 years and then was reversed. So one thing you may have heard is this quote, oh, the challenge of industrial policy is letting losers go. For democracies, it may actually be keeping the winners long enough. The last thing I'll say is about pro-competitive industrial policy. So this is another thing you hear all the time. Industrial policy should be pro-competitive. That comes from a paper by Anne Harrison and Philippe Aguillon and co-authors that was actually elected the best paper of the Chinese Economic Association in 2015. It shows that subsidies and other policies are more effective at raising productivity when they're dispersed across firms in an industry. So the idea is that if all firms have equal access to subsidies, they compete. If you just give it to one, that's sometimes called picking a winner, they will have less incentive to innovate because they have a cost advantage. But China is a very specific economy. It's so large, you have so many firms that you have so much competition in the domestic market. In most of our countries, that's not the case. You may have just one firm or two. How do you create competition then? Well, a message is from Japan. So in Japan in the 50s and 60s, one thing they did is they actually organized cartels in particular industries, and they broke up some of the antitrust laws imposed by the Allied government in order to implement their industrial policy by doing investment and so forth. Yet, they also required the cartels to export. So even though there was no competition in the domestic market, they faced competition from the international market. And a study found that there was actually very little impact on sector margins. So I think the intuition there is that you should have some sort of pursuit of exports or export discipline This is, of course, a challenge because export contingencies are prohibited by WTO rules. One suggestion about that is that you can actually use WTO to your advantage. So, if you want to, WTO litigation takes a long time. So maybe try an export contingency. People will sue you. You'll get through the process 5 years later, 10 years later, and then you'll know whether it works and you can repeal it. Just to suggest. This is from Bernard Heckman, who told me this. All right, which activities to target? Okay, this is the hardest question to answer, and I think the one we get the most. We have limited to say, but just some rule of thumb. So one thing we highlight is that you want to focus on doing new activities in the economy. One person summarized this as to say that industrial policy is not something you do in favor of people, it's something you do against the incumbents. Why do we say this? So there have been a lot of studies estimating, the economic case for industrial policy by saying, oh, there's different externalities across industries, but these studies, I think it's safe to say, don't give generalizable conclusions. So one paper finds that the scale economies are largest in rubber and plastic, another finds that they're the smallest. Who to believe, which methodology, to choose. This is, I think, interesting in a seminar, but not something that policymakers can get a handle on. So for that reason, we emphasize this rule of thumb to say, if you're doing something that's new in the economy, you'll have more knowledge spillovers, so the workers will be doing tasks for the first time. You'll be buying inputs that haven't been demanded in the economy before. And we're pretty safe to say that that can lead to some positive externalities. And in fact, many countries are still targeting old industries. So in Kenya, tea is still in the national industrialization strategy. In Serbia, there's this great study from the World Bank that shows that 92% of firms receiving subsidies don't do any R&D. So this is a simple check, that you can see to see, are you pushing innovation? One thing we say is that though externalities are hard to measure, you can measure feasibility. You can look at the revealed comparative advantage or technological relatedness. Is the market growing? How is the competition? These are sort of strategic sort of business strategy approaches. One thing we highlight is that so if a product already has a revealed comparative advantage, probably you don't want to subsidize it with incentives anymore, but you could still give it public inputs to grow the industry. If it's medium risk, meaning it's like a nearby product, so suppose you're doing semiconductor testing and you want to move into wafer manufacturing, that would be one example. Those can get incentives, and then high risk ones are just harder to get to. That would be semiconductors in the Republic of Chad. So a question is, what is your government's risk tolerance? On the institutions, so we highlight, as Anna said, a set of institutions that are outside of the executive and the sort of trade ministries that typically get attention. And we use this framework of Danny Roderick to say that for industrial policy to be successful, you need these three qualities. And then a contribution of the report is to show how these qualities can be mapped or achieved in 7 different agencies. So embeddedness is ties between the agency and the business community. You can do this by having private sector membership on the board, also through diagnostic studies. Using incentives, we talked a lot about important to have termination dates, but as I said, 10 years is probably a good target. Extension only if productivity is improving. And then accountability, is just kind of standard stuff, but it varies by agency. And here's a picture. So we have detail of all these different agencies and the tools they can implement, and some of the research on their effectiveness. I want to highlight one, which is public-private dialogue that I have a new working paper out on. So this has been done by the World Bank for a long time, where you get business and relevant regulators and government together to talk about issues and fix them. We find that at the economy-wide, they're associated with a step up in growth. At the industry level, the results are a bit more mixed, but we do find positive average effects when you target products without revealed comparative advantage. So new industries that the country hasn't specialized in. and especially also in economies with sort of weaker governance. So this can kind of substitute for governance. I think the Nigeria fertilizer is one of the great success stories of here. So you had this little reform organization, and then Nigeria became an exporter of fertilizer. This is growth of here. And we have a lot of experts in the bank on this. Lily Sisombat and Ben Hertzberg, I'll acknowledge, among others. Okay, so I want to talk just very briefly about a couple applications. So we talked about just how to grow industries in general. I think this is generic. It has to do with that framework of trying to diversify. But of course, there are specific goals like jobs and reducing pollution, which I'll talk about. So, and in the report, we have two others. One is earning foreign exchange, so exports, and then economic resilience. I'll talk about jobs. So we highlight three trade-offs here that I think we're only beginning to grapple with at the World Bank. One is about more versus better jobs. So a lot of approaches has said, hey, let's target the industries that employ a lot of people. They can create jobs at scale. Those are typically low-wage industries, retail, transportation. In contrast, sort of skill or capital-intensive industries will raise productivity and maybe offer high-wage jobs, but for a smaller number of people. Now, the bank's framework, I think thanks to Art's coordination, does measure more and better jobs as changes in the wage bill, but you still may get a case where you can sort of hit these more easily with the more versus the better. And so we want to, I think, emphasize that governments should be thinking about both those things at the same time. You should be having a, say, low-skill job strategy and also a growth strategy for getting new industries and capital. The second is about, do you subsidize labor or capital? I think the simple point is that if you subsidize capital, you make workers more productive, so you don't have to pay the subsidy every year, so it may be cheaper to subsidize capital, and you should focus on labor subsidies when there's investment in human capital required, like the Romania example I gave. And then another thing we emphasize is people think about industrial policy as being a way to assist workers displaced by trade or technology, or perhaps protect them from displacement. There's evidence that suggests, I think it's better, we suggest, actually to do sort of broad safety net programs that can catch people in any type of transition rather than target to a particular disruption. I think the example I use here is the US Trade Adjustment Assistance Program actually required a specific investigation for each plant to show that the workers were displaced because of trade. You can imagine how difficult that was. So it was a hard program for people to adopt. By contrast, Brazil has a broad sort of skills retraining program that has benefited people displaced by trade, but is easier to access. I'm almost done. So for green, I think people use green industrial policy in a very loose way. They often, anything that is sort of remotely related to the environment, say I'm going to, build my own solar panels or EVs, they say that's green industrial policy. We take a narrower definition that we think is more useful, which is to say that if you want to reduce pollution, carbon emissions, SO2 emissions, firms need to take costly actions. They need to change their production methods, and they're going to do that subject to regulation. So green industrial policy is about helping firms make that transition while protecting their competitiveness. We highlight three ways to do that. So one is just free emissions allowances rather than having to pay for them. Carbon border adjustment is being used in Europe is a sort of a mechanism to do that. Sometimes governments also give subsidies for adopting low pollution technologies. A caveat here is that may actually increase energy use, and so if you have a dirty grid, you can actually increase emissions. So you need to think about that. And then third, again, very common, in the US where I'm from for a brief period of time, was to say let's require that, in order to get subsidies for green tech, it needs to be built in the country. There, I think, you have real trade-offs between benefiting local firms and getting the cheapest technology like solar panels. So we have 4 I's, okay, so this is the second to last, the penultimate slide. How should you, bring all this together? Think if you want to prioritize your industrial strategy, here's how you do it. So you start with institutions, that's these implementing agencies, but it's also investments in fundamentals. If you're saying, like India is, we're going to do industrial policy temporarily, like while we work on fundamentals, let's have a timeline to deliver those fundamentals. Second, focus on these public inputs. They're cheap. It's very cheap to have a well-functioning export promotion agency to promote industrial parks. Should be tailored, but not necessarily exclusive to an industry. Next, you go to the incentives, but these are costlier either to the fiscal or to other producers or consumers in the economy, like tariffs. And then finally, these macroeconomic interventions I think we're the most skeptical of, both because they're technically difficult to implement or they may not be very targeted. So an R&D credit can be just captured by firms that were going to do the R&D anyway. Lastly, I want to say, for the operational colleagues in the audience, we have some avenues for using this report for client engagement. I want to highlight three. So first is just, if you're having policy dialogue around a lending operation, we're happy to do a virtual seminar around the report. We can tailor it a bit to the country and sort of debate these different tools that are being used, like procurement and subsidies. Sort of more detailed partnerships going forward, I'll highlight two. So one that we're exploring in the Philippines is to do an activity which is kind of a complement to a public finance review. So this would be to map in the economy, who is spending what on different industrial policy tools, which agencies are implementing different regulations, and then what are the opportunities to improve that. Again, in a lot of countries, there's very well-written strategies, but actually there's less clarity from a ministerial level about who's doing what and what's being spent. And at least in the Philippines, we think we can add value there. And then third would be for a country that has more implementation capacity, more data, quality data, like Brazil, for example. We can do detailed research studies looking at the impacts of policies. I think one key thing that comes up a lot is, what is the fiscal payback period? So, you spend some money on subsidies, but maybe you grew some new firms, they pay taxes. When does that net out? I think we don't know. And so now I'm done. Thank you very much.
Hi, Aditya. I think you were calling my name, but I'm not sure your microphone was on. So if this is the cue for me to come in.
Yes, Martin. Martin, it is the cue. Sorry. Now my mic is on. Over to you, Martin.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much, Anna and Tristan. As you know, I've been a consumer of this report and actually a user of it even before it was published. I was interested in the topic because for a while, I was, I could have been included in your sample of not country economists, but country directors who feel that I'm constantly being asked the question and I don't really know what to say. And so I was very happy that you took on the challenge. And I really like the results. So now I could stop there, but I'm going to say a few more things. I think what I like about it is that I think it's very practical. It's really a policy guide, and you don't shy away from saying, if you're in this situation, if your market size is small, then don't do this. Or if you don't have fiscal capacity, then don't do this. And you have a table which links all the various instruments and looks at the rationale for using them, and then basically says, this is a first choice instrument, this is a second choice instrument. So I think it's really quite practical. And what's also useful about it is that you don't stop at first choice. You recognize that the majority of governments feel that they want and need to do something. So not acting is not an option, and you take the second choice problem head on. But of course, that makes it also very complicated. And I'll come back to this because I think in practice, a lot of things are second choice, and then things don't work out quite as they're intended, and unintended consequences get countries into trouble. I also like the attention you placed on institutions. It came out a little bit in at the end of your intervention, Tristan, but I do think industrial policy is often carried out under significant uncertainty, And so you do need an institutional framework for discovering what policies might work, and having strong institutions that, on the one hand, manage to have active dialogue with industry, and on the other hand, are embedded in the Roderick or Peter Evans sense, but on the other hand, are sufficiently autonomous to shut people off and to prevent rent seeking, is really quite critical. And I'll come back to that as well, because I actually think this is rather rare, which may account for the fact that we don't have so many success cases. And finally, I think it's just an excellent survey of the literature, and one that really puts the multitude of studies in a very interesting framework. Now, where I remain a little less convinced, the first point is, I take your hypothesis that the political economy for industrial policy has improved. I'm just not sure I would be so optimistic. So I agree that the availability of talent is greater than it was. And I agree that economies are more integrated and more open. And as a result, there is a stronger measuring rod of competition, of international competition, that prevents you from making terrible mistakes. But the political incentives for rent seeking, it seems to me, are in no way diminished. And I've worked in a sufficient number of countries, from Brazil to Bangladesh to China, and have observed these political incentives, and they're very strong. And even in countries with significant government capacity, they may be stronger than the ability of government to maintain a focus on the underlying objectives. And that's particularly the case when you need to exit subsidies. Let's just take the case of China. There's a lot that's been said about how China has been excellent at organizing a very competitive framework. Yuan Ang has just written a nice blog in response to your report, in which she lays out her theory of how China was so successful. But then there is ample evidence that Chinese subsidies are a colossal waste of money, precisely because local governments find it impossible to retrieve them, even when it's long past clear that their local champions are not going to be selected as national champions. And this is not really welfare enhancing for China, but it's also having huge collateral damage on the rest of the world. And the study of Barak and colleagues that you quote on shipbuilding is one of those examples where China ended up building more ships than everybody else, but less efficiently than the ones that they displaced. And subsidies played an important part in this, but it's not clear it improved global welfare. It's not even clear to me it improved Chinese welfare. So I would be a bit circumspect. And then if you add to this the limited fiscal space in many developing countries in the context of high levels of indebtedness and an interest rate scenario that looks a lot less favorable than the scenario that prevailed during much of the period in which the studies that are marshaled in support of evidence for industrial policy were written, then I come up with a somewhat more circumspect view on whether the conditions for getting this right are really so much better than in the past. But I acknowledge that the arguments are that you're right to be more balanced than we were in 1993. I still, as a reader of the report and as a user of it, would give it a more skeptical overall flavor. And then I think an issue that you didn't emphasize much in your presentation, but which is, I think, discussed nicely in the report, is the problem of multiple objectives. You have this nice analogy in talking about the second best of a car that has broken suspension and a flat tire, and you decide you can't fix both of those things, so you decide to blow up the tire, but only halfway, so that it acts as a bit of a balance. And you described it as a second best, but it's also an analogy that sometimes you want a car that both has good tires and and has good suspension. And many countries are trying to use one instrument, subsidies or import tariffs or local content requirements, to hit multiple objectives, keep certain political constituencies happy, particularly in certain regions of the country, develop a particular industry to improve their competitive position, create jobs, and so on and so forth. And I think there's ample evidence to suggest that that is certainly second best, and it may not be very efficient. And I do think it is a problem. And it is a problem even in constituencies like Europe, which is where I'm based now, where in principle the government bandwidth is sufficiently high for them, and the range of instruments available is sufficiently large for them to use one instrument to target a particular objective. But you read the latest EU Industrial Accelerator Act, and it has multiple objectives, and it strikes me that it risks missing them as a result. And that leads me to a final question, which is, I think you presented, Tristan, some good and supportive evidence for the impact of industrial policy, but there've been quite a number of papers. I mentioned the evidence of China, but there's also some papers that came out of the latest MAGIC database in the OECD that really don't find very much of an effect on productivity at all. So you may be getting a temporary effect on employment, you may be getting a temporary effect on output or exports, but they tend to fade over time. And so I'm left with a little bit of a puzzle. I mean, clearly successful countries have all employed some form of industrial policy or another, but even under good circumstances, and I think you mentioned, you quote some of the analytical work that has simulated what would happen if governments could design optimal industrial policies, and the welfare benefits of that, are in the range of 1% of 1 to 4% of GDP, much lower than what accounts for the success of, say, the East Asian tigers as opposed to other developing countries. And so clearly complementary factors matter a lot, and you give them a lot of attention, rightfully, in your report. And yet I am worried that clients may forget about the enabling conditions, because those are all associated with difficult political economy problems. Perhaps the most important one, making sure you have factor markets that work adequately, so that when you're supporting a certain industry, you're not just driving up the prices, but you have factors of production actually moving into into the sector that you want to support. And if you forget about those and you just focus on the industrial policy part, you may end up having disappointing results. So I think my overall conclusion is that the report is extremely timely. I think it much deserves the attention that it's been getting. It's extremely useful for policymakers, and it's particularly useful for policymakers who take the patience to either listen to your excellent presentation with all of its caveats, or to read the report in detail. What I would worry about is those policymakers who take it away and say, oh, now I have a blanket check to do what I always wanted to do, and forget about all of the caveats and the enabling conditions that you so rightfully emphasize, and that we, as a result of this report, don't accumulate more cases of successful implementation of industrial policies, but more cases of what Josh Lerner called boulevards of broken dreams. With that, thank you very much, and look forward to the remaining discussions.
Thank you very much, Martin, for your very thoughtful comments. Especially your last comment resonated with me, that this outstanding report does raise a question. For example, from India to Indonesia, governments have in place numerous restrictive policies which have undermined their manufacturing competitiveness and contributed to the marginalization of both these large countries from global value chains, whether it's tariffs or non-tariff measures or restrictions on labor markets. And now Indonesia is restricting exports of commodities to encourage downstream industries. India is introducing subsidies for local production. So one general question is, shouldn't governments stop doing harm before they start doing good? And are we seeing the elimination of harm as a precondition for successful industrial policy? Or are we being tempted into using industrial policies to offset the adverse impact of governments which are shooting themselves in the foot? But I'll leave you both to think about that question in addition to the very nice points Martin said and his very justified appreciation of this wonderful report. And over to all of you for questions. And first, my old and esteemed friend, Will Martin, who I hope will also talk about industrial policy in agriculture.
Oh, that's a big challenge. I was really interested. Thank you very much, too, for an excellent report and a wonderful presentation. Really interested in the comments on the special economic zones. I mean, I think it's worth, if you go back to the 1980s, China didn't actually look very promising in many respects. I mean, the challenges were so high. If you were wanting to export labor-intensive manufacturers, you didn't have access to intermediates. The tariff and non-tariff regime killed that. The capital markets didn't work for this sort of development. So, the policy really was, the special economic zones were one element of it. But quickly investors would come back and they'd say, they're too busy and it's too hard. But because they made access to intermediate inputs without duties and so on, and even purchase of funding of inputs, and foreign investors opened, so then they solved all of those problems. But investors would suddenly go beyond the special economic zones, what seemed to be more important at the time, and it was the access to intermediate inputs. And the mayor of the next town would be happy to roll out the red carpet for them. And that seemed to be more important than the infrastructure, in many cases, than the infrastructure that went with special economic zones. So I wonder if that's a general kind of a finding. I could talk about agriculture and horticulture, but one question's probably enough.
Thank you, Will. Ergis?
Thank you for the presentation. I'll skip the congratulatory words because we've made them before. I was curious about the chart at the beginning where you looked back at all the World Bank reports, and it was impressive that they were kind of lukewarm on SOEs and also on tax incentives and subsidies, but they were against trade measures, if I understood correctly. So after you've done all these reports and you've put a lot of thought about how to do industrial policy, how do you evaluate the World Bank economy's somewhat intuitive take on industrial policy over the last 20 years? Did they do it right or did they do something wrong?
Will?
Well, thank you, and congratulations to both on this. I want to ask sort of maybe about, you do a very nice job of sort of tying the advisability of different policies to the conditions within a country. It strikes me that often when you're talking about, say, an attractive sector where there might be room for a new entrant, you're talking about imperfect competition. And then usually we'd have to be thinking about what other actors are doing. And so in particular, I wanted to pose the question from a bank perspective, what we're all worried about, which is, let's just imagine that there's a sector where there's room for a new entrant, a lucrative sector, but you've got a dozen countries that want to grab that slot. Are we supposed to advise all 12 countries to do it? Do we select which one is going to do it the best? And when we do our ex post evaluation, should we just look at the one that succeeded, or should we look at all 12?
It's a very nice question. Arti?
Actually, I had a question similar to what Ergis asked. So maybe just to add to what Ergis asked, if you look at your framework, Anna and Tristan, on the different government capabilities, fiscal space, and local market size, So what as we World Bank Group operations have been doing, and where do we fit in that matrix that we have, if you've looked at the operations side of it. Another thing which you mentioned, Tristan, was on, these instruments are supposed to be short-term, but they become long-term. But our development problems are long-term. So on the, the typology of instruments that you have looked at, do you have views on which should be long-term? For example, industrial zones, or maybe public inputs, which would never be provided by the market at all. So would you have some thoughts on that? And maybe even, looking at our own operations, can we see where our instruments have been on this time horizon as well? Thank you.
Anna and Tristan, thank you so much. I'm Valentina. I've been a big fan of your report. I've talked to both of you. And I think Martin made such a great point about Yuan An's blog recently. She was my professor, and I read that as well. And one of the key questions she posed in her report in response to your report is that we all know the debate is not whether governments should intervene. Most of them already do, but the real question is how can they do it when they do not know in advance what will work? And one of the responses from your report is that you will experiment and then adapt. I think my question then is most countries don't have, room and a lot of resources to continuously experiment, especially when you say it should be a 10-year experiment at least. So I'm curious if we have any framework further from your report, how should they identify where to start experimenting and maximize their chance to success?
Last question for this round from Stephen.
Thank you. Such a fascinating report. So my question is sort of a bit of the flip side of how to do industrial policy, and related to Aditya's point, how your advice, but how not to do industrial policy. So sort of if you come from an older, maybe an older literature, there's so many examples of complete disasters of industrial policy, steel mills that never produce steel and cost billions of dollars in low-income countries and things like that. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, perhaps related to limiting the costs. To, for example, instead of having an active subsidy, having a tax holiday limits the size of the subsidy to the size of the tax, for example. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Anna, Tristan, in whatever order you prefer.
I'll start. Thank you, everyone, for the questions, and thanks, Martin, wherever you are, very much for your comments. Especially, I guess, yes, toning down our optimism, it's important, but I think the complementary policies, I think we need to make that point more strongly, especially if according to you, you feel that governments with no time to read are going to take this as, freedom to use industrial policy in whatever tool, in whatever way they want. So we need to find a way to have our, maybe our last slide be more upfront in discussions or in things that we're going to publish. So I'll start I'll take a few questions. First, Will Martin's question, and you could not speak to someone who's more, happy to talk about reducing tariffs on intermediate inputs. So certainly that was as you said, an important thing in China. And in the report, we discussed this a little bit it's towards the end, chapter 6, when we think about industrial policy with a goal to to increase foreign exchange. And thanks to our colleague Elena Janchovicina, she reminded us of, duty drawback schemes that she said was never possible to include in any bank report, or no one ever cited her paper, but we were able to cite her paper and the importance that had in China and for other countries. So certainly that's, that's a policy that's important before other policies are used. So other questions on the World Bank, I mean, some of them are, I think, food for thought that we need to think about, I think, going forward. You know, did the World Bank do it right in terms of being more or less favorable to industrial policy in the policy loans? I think what's you know, I don't know if the World Bank did right or wrong, but certainly the World Bank has there's been a lot of operations that cover, especially the public inputs. So we didn't say that, and we have some other analysis that didn't make it to the report. We analyzed a lot of so this was the development policy loans only, but we also looked at projects in the area of industry, trade, and agriculture, I think. And there was a lot of, you know, a lot of funding of, you know, SEZs, of even skills development program, export promotion. So the bank has engaged with what we define as industrial policy. And it's often not classified as such. But I don't know that we have an opinion on whether the bank did right or wrong. And on Phil, I will let Tristan say more, but we've experienced exactly that concern about, you know, many countries wanting to promote the same sector, and what does the bank do? And that's currently ongoing in the Value Chain Impact Academy, which is promoting agribusiness in 6 countries. Some of them are the same, you know, avocados here and avocados there. I don't know what's going to happen on that front. Let me give you a chance to...
Sure, thanks. I think we calibrated the optimism correctly. Anna always concedes more than I do, but and why do I think that? So I want to come back to Martin's comments about sort of failure and waste, and I think it came from some other people. So we have this way at the bank of talking about industrial policies, and I see it in reports everywhere. We say, oh, here's a tax exemption, here's a subsidy. It's a distortion. And indeed, that's true. It's exactly what it is. You're trying to incentivize one thing rather than another. But the idea is that in the long run, like over 10 years, you will create a new industry, or you maybe will create links between sectors that didn't exist before. And you know, people have modeled this. This is the old discussion, you know, from the 50s. These are not old ideas, but I think we're looking at it we're seeing more costs because we're looking at the short term. And I have 2 things in particular I want to highlight, and I think we need to change the way we think about waste and rents. So waste, Martin brought this up. If you talk to the Chinese, I mean, this is a fundamental part of the way it works. Like, of course there's lots of waste. You have all these different EV companies, but they've cut the prices in half over time. And Chinese academics would say, actually, the reason their system is unique is because the local governments can resist the temptation to protect locally and actually have this large competition in the economy. So that's going to look very bad in the short run, but you know, we have changed the world in multiple industries there. The other one is rents. So in a lot of cases, you're going to have a single entrepreneur be successful. Think about Nigeria, the cement industry. Aliko Dangote was protected in cement. It had very high income margins. But then in the stock, the margins go down over time because he's investing and expanding across Africa and increasing competition in other countries. So, but again, that happened over a decade.
Is your successful fertilizer story also a Dangote story?
It is, in fact.
Can you talk a bit more about that?
I mean, he used the local resources, and they're now exporting urea. They're also doing a refinery, which was actually more of a first choice policy. I think there's been some discussions about how protected the refinery is, but they did, development bank investments, and an SEZ with tax exemptions were the sort of main things that supported that. So again, I think this is just this idea that the gains from this stuff is going to be structural transformation over the long term, and of course that's going to look bad in a static model. It'll look like misallocation, but it may not be. Just say, Valentina, I think about experimenting, and I think this gets at Stephen's point a little bit, is, we say rather than emphasizing just one project, you should do many, and some of them will fail. I don't know if I answered Stephen's actually. And then, you just want to try, and you can have, broader targets, which is I think the bank's approach to say we're going to do, high value manufacturing, and that can, include many experiments, some of which fail. About the other countries, I don't know. I think this is a barrier to doing peer learning events because it's just going to be difficult to have a conversation like that. I don't know if you see there's opportunities and you tell a couple of countries to maybe think about it. I think maybe they just race. So, but we've been doing that in agriculture forever, right? We've been supporting the same crops in many countries. So I don't know if this is different. Okay.
Especially coffee in both Papua New Guinea and Vietnam, where Vietnam's productivity is many times that in Papua New Guinea. More questions? Please, Elvin and Anupam.
Sure, yeah, no, thanks.
We have a hand up on the screen.
Sorry, I should have remembered you all. Elvin, ask the question quickly, Anupam briefly, and then we turn to WebEx. And
yes, definitely. Thanks a lot for this talk and also the reports. My question was about kind of identity, kind of one of the kind of the sector's choices, obviously $1 million or even $1 billion question. You're kind of saying, okay, we should emphasize kind of the new, but you're also kind of saying, okay, we should focus on kind of products where we have a real comparative advantage, which is very much a backward-looking measure. What's wrong with kind of focusing on the old? Because that's often where maybe the comparative advantages of countries are. Thanks.
Well, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. First of all, congratulations on this report. You must have marshaled a lot of facts, and much of them are relevant, but there are, I at least did not see any reference to, I think there's a lot more on industrial policy, including produced out of the bank. But the reason I say that is that narrative you have, the facts that you have said, your narrative is plausible, but there is a very counter narrative, which sort of is also plausible, and that's why I find this, I'm not sure if I call your report optimistic or pessimistic. I think of it as a positive. So, but what I would suggest is that I have actually many specific questions, but we don't have time for those. But what you've taken is a very reductionist approach. Objective, here is the policy instrument, and maybe it matches, doesn't match, or succeeds or not doesn't succeed. But perhaps a better way to take this is, given that industrial policy, the core problem is a coordination problem, at least that's the one I take away from you, that to take perhaps the success stories and the combination of instruments that match those and achieve those, as opposed to this, because almost all the industry, whether you take fertilizer in Nigeria or India, or software in India, all of those are actually almost all the success stories that people talk about. And China, machinery industry, the semiconductor industry in Korea. There was a time when the bank basically felt that these were all losers. I can say that for a fact during the 80s. So I'm wondering, to what extent did you consider such an approach, looking at that? And secondly, a couple of points, comments, and I'll come back to that. I don't think a 20-year approach is 20-year framework or time frame for evaluating what you've done is the correct one, because that's the beginning of the neoliberal paradigm here. And in most, it's not just the World Bank, but overall, and most of the industrial policy that was implemented was actually during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And that's, and when you look at that, the story is very different.
Thank you, Anupam. I want to bring Bamboo online first.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for this excellent report. My name is Bambo Salami. I'm from the IFC. I lead our manufacturing business in East and Southern Africa. This is really an excellent report. I think it helps us discuss industrial policy no longer in hushed tones, but actually frankly and openly. It's a great report because it's real, okay? And it's better to discuss this in the open. Look, from my experience at the IFC, look, the devil is always in the details. Whenever we get to firms or we get to countries, in the same country, you find examples of where industrial policy has been excellently done and you have good results. In the same country, you can also find bad results or average results. So again, it's a function of life is complex, and I think what this report gives is it gives us a framework and also acknowledges the uncertainties there. I've got three questions for the authors. I think the first is the framework you have around market size, fiscal space, and institutional capacity. How do you also consider the presence of endowments? Natural endowment in the country? Is it good? I mean, I think, Justin, you mentioned the example of Nigeria with the refinery in there. I mean, Nigeria's got so much crude and gas, and for over 50 years, there was never a refinery. So it just made sense for you to have a fertilizer plant and a refinery there. So it's good to hear your thoughts on that. Second is, when you look at the tools, the industrial policy tools, what we've also seen in many countries is you need to deploy them as a package, all right? So if you just focus on one, let's say tariffs, and don't get the rest done, basically you get all the costs and none of the benefits. How does your report go into just looking at the tools as a suit that need to all be implemented to get the right objectives? And then my final question is feedback loops on industrial policy. Again, this is always the challenge where policy is put in place, but the policy holders are not tracking, where things need to be recalibrated, tinkered with, and adjusted, because you never know what's going to work until you start using it. What's been your experience there? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bambo. Martin, over to you. We're going to overrun by about a few minutes, and I think that's okay. And Martin, if you, in your intervention, could also talk a little bit about how you think of the IFC. I don't want to put you on a spot as an exercise or as a practitioner of industrial policy in terms of, its own notions of viability, additionality, and development impact.
Thanks. The reason I raised my hand is because I can't resist doing a rejoinder to Tristan's, I think, very well taken and spirited defense of the optimistic nuance of the report. And the reason I wanted to come back in is because when you look at the IMF studies on China, for example, it's not like they're looking at 2-3 years. They're looking at, a fairly extensive time period. I think very close to the 10 years that you consider as a reasonable period to look at. But I think more importantly, if everybody does what China does, we're going to get into beggar thy neighbor, because in a sense, what China does is to push other people out of their market share, not necessarily by improving overall productivity in that sector, but by basically trying to win a subsidy race. Now, China is lucky that it has the resources to do this. And from its own strategic point of view, this may well be an optimal strategy. It's just not obvious to me that we should be advocating at large to take that approach. And I'm simplifying here. And as a former China country director, I should be very careful what I say here, because I have a lot of admiration for what the Chinese have achieved. But I'm not sure the majority of it comes from their use of subsidies. I think much of it comes from competition. And if they didn't have the subsidies, they would still have very productive champions, but without the waste that comes with it. So I think this is a debate we should continue, and we don't have time for here now. I think your question, Aditya, to respond to the IFC, I mean, naturally, the IFC makes choices all the time. Which sectors to invest in? I mean, if you sit in an IFC, credit review meeting, they will look at, is the sector perspective and demand? What are the input risks, etc.? And what are government policy risks that you face? So naturally, they look at this from an investor point of view very much, like the way a policymaker would need to do if they wanted to look at successful investments. I think one of the things that I would hope to see more in the IFC is more failure, but then also bigger wins. I mean, I do think we have it's too risk averse. It probably should be operating more like a private equity firm, and IFC's 2030 strategy seems to be aiming to go in that direction. And the second thing is, I think IFC, as a publicly owned company, can can obviously take a patient view, and in that sense, it is better able to act a little bit along the lines of what Tristan suggested. It can afford to see through a complicated beginnings and hold on to its assets without being immediately subject to pressure from the owners. So I do think it's an interesting example. And to say something which I thought has been very interesting in my observation of China, I mean, they have plenty of these government guidance funds, which basically operate a little bit like, mutually competitive, often state-based public equity funds. And in that sense, they're just a multiplication of lots of mini IFCs owned by state-level governments. And I think the fact that they're in competition with one another has contributed to driving China's technological progress.
Thank you very much, Martin, for your participation, for your thoughtful comments, and I agree completely with you. While it's fashionable to sort of blame or attribute to industrial policy China's success, I think this combination of scale and competition in China's large market, plus their advances in technology and adoption, are really playing a very significant role. A final minute each to Tristan and Anna for...
Let me go. So I agree on China that there's a lot more going on there than industrial policy. I'll just answer your question and also Bambo's. So endowment, so we talked about the country characteristics, but then there's also the sector, right? And that's how you select the sector, which is exactly based on endowments and things that your country should be naturally good at. I think the idea with the old and the new is that even if you're in an old or something you're already exporting, you should be trying to do something new that's value added. And so my understanding is this is exactly what the country private sector diagnostic approach of the World Bank does. It says, what are you already good at? You're already exporting mangoes. Let's try to make mango juice or other kinds of, tropical fruit cultivation. So that's the idea, just to look at what you're good at and find something new. And in my terminology, that would be a medium risk jump, right? So something slightly new.
I'll also mention to Bamba's question on endowments that actually, as you may know, the regional economic updates this past spring all had a chapter on industrial policy that took our report as a basis, but they took it in further directions, and in particular the Africa one from the Africa Chief Economist Office, they did augment our typology to also add something on endowment. So you should check that, because they separate, cases of countries that are, heavy in mineral resources and so on, and it's an interesting framework to look at. As for there were questions on packages of tools. Yes, we know that's very important. The evidence often focuses on identifying the impact of one tool, even though other tools are also present. So it's been a little bit more driven by evidence that we decided to provide evidence on each tool.
Thank you very much. I think this excellent report has many qualities, but I think the best quality is provocation. It's generated debate outside today. I know we haven't answered all your questions, but if you can think of this as the beginning of a conversation. Thank you very much, Anna and Tristan. Thank you, Martin, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm sorry.
This meeting is no longer being recorded.